The Thomas and Grandma Show, all 69 episodes. Episode 1, Grandma's Awful Day. Plot: it is a humdrum day in Utica, New York. On an unsuspecting street in the Anderson household, Thomas is sleeping on his bed. Grandma is driving home from the grocery store. Thomas wakes up and plans to allot his entire day with playing Fortnite. Thomas gets onto a round and gets eliminated in 17 seconds. Thomas gets into another round but gets eliminated in 1 second. Thomas screams like a god and continues playing. Over the course of an hour, the neighborhood hears sporadic screaming. Thomas is screaming every time he is eliminated from a round. Then Grandma pulls into the driveway as Thomas lets out a mega roar. Thomas screeches and screams as Grandma enters the house. Soon Grandma screams for Thomas to help bring in the groceries. Thomas goes downstairs and brings everything in. 10 seconds later, Thomas runs upstairs and resumes screaming at his TV. Thomas's agile thoughts cause him to bust his TV when he gets eliminated for the 92nd time. Thomas takes out a crowbar and smashes the wall and everything fragile he owns. Grandma walks outside to do some gardening. 10 minutes later, Thomas takes out a chainsaw. Thomas's not so smart idea is to saw his furniture apart. Meanwhile, outside, Grandma is planting tomato and carrot seeds. Soon Grandma hears a chainsaw turning on. Grandma ignores it. A minute later, she hears strange crashing sounds. Grandma soon hears a massive crash. Grandma gets up and walks inside. Grandma walks upstairs and hears crashing sounds. Grandma walks into Thomas's bedroom. She sees Thomas smashing his entire bedroom. Grandma sighs and walks back to her garden. 20 minutes later, Grandma hears a massive explosion. She looks up and sees smoke coming from Thomas's bedroom. Grandma screams in anger because she can't get 5 minutes of peace. Thomas walks outside with C4. A few seconds later, Grandma's garden implodes. Grandma sighs and walks away. 30 seconds later, Grandma gets into her car and drives off. 30 minutes later, she returns home with gardening supplies. Thomas gets an idea, an awful idea, a wonderful awful idea. Thomas walks inside and drags Grandma's memento case outside. Thomas grabs a stick of explosives and lights it up. Thomas places it inside Grandma's case of mementos. A few seconds later, Grandma hears a massive explosion. Grandma runs to the driveway and sees the remains of her memento case. Grandma screams and runs inside. Grandma comes outside a few minutes later. She has an eviction notice for Thomas. Thomas screams and rips up the notice. Grandma walks inside again. 3 minutes later, she returns with a suitcase. Grandma tells Thomas he is going to the pound. Thomas screams in anger and takes out lighter fluid. A few minutes later, Grandma's car is put up in flames. Grandma sighs and extinguishes the fire. Thomas screams and takes out a button. Thomas presses the button. Soon the house collapses on itself. Grandma sighs when she realizes she is now homeless. Thomas and Grandma walk away and get onto a bus. 30 minutes later, they get off and walk to Grandma's skyscraper. Thomas enters the skyscraper and runs to his bedroom. 30 seconds later, Grandma hears very loud screaming. Grandma sighs and walks to her bedroom. 4 minutes later, Grandma falls asleep. A few minutes later, Thomas goes to sleep. End of episode. Episode 2. Thomas and Grandma go to Burger King. Plot: it is a peaceful afternoon in Utica, New York. In the Anderson household, Thomas is advocating for himself because he wants Burger King. Grandma roars at Thomas. 3 seconds later, Thomas drags Grandma to the kitchen. 3 minutes later, Grandma agrees to Burger King. Thomas and Grandma walk out to Grandma's Tesla. Soon they get into the Tesla. 10 seconds later, Grandma speeds off to Burger King. 15 seconds later, Thomas takes out a laser pointer. Soon he shines into a police officer's eyes. 5 minutes later, Grandma gets a $30,000 ticket because Thomas created a flagrant 80 vehicle pileup with his laser pointer. 3 seconds later, Grandma roars at Thomas for causing an atrocity. Soon she rips his laser pointer in half. 10 seconds later, Thomas takes out an expired egg salad sandwich from his pants. Half a second later, Thomas throws the sandwich at the windshield. Grandma screams in terror as she crashes her Tesla into a tree. Soon Thomas gets thrown onto the street. A few seconds later, Thomas drags Grandma's Tesla out of a steep ditch. 5 minutes later, Grandma resumes driving. 2 minutes later, Thomas begins running like a crazy person. Soon Grandma pulls into Burger King. Thomas races inside. A few minutes later, Thomas roars in anger when there is no chocolate pies left. Soon Grandma sighs as Thomas runs into the kitchen. Soon he takes out a 5F-4.43 device. Soon Grandma tells everyone to evacuate. 10 seconds later, Grandma grabs her weapon of mass destruction. A few seconds later, Thomas wreaks havoc in the bathroom. Soon Grandma screams in anger as Thomas destroys the entire restaurant. 3 minutes later, Thomas finishes destroying the entire restaurant. Soon Grandma drags Thomas to the Tesla. 30 seconds later, Grandma speeds home. 10 seconds later, Thomas takes out a glitter bomb. Thomas ignites the glitter bomb. Soon glitter flies all over the car. A few seconds later, Grandma crashes into her garage. Grandma gets out while dragging Thomas. A few seconds later, Grandma walks up to Thomas's bedroom. 10 seconds later, Grandma gets a reprisal at Thomas by blowing up his bedroom with multiple glitter bombs. Soon Thomas wakes up. Thomas runs up to his bedroom. 10 seconds later, Thomas vows to get revenge on Grandma. Soon Grandma walks into the John. 10 seconds later, Thomas walks over to Grandma's personal pool. A few minutes later, Thomas rips a massive hole in the pool liner. Soon Grandma walks to the deck. 5 seconds later, Grandma screams in anger when she sees her pool. Grandma walks to her car. Soon Grandma roars at Thomas for taking all the wheels off. A few seconds later, Thomas swallows a lug nut so Grandma can't repair her car. Grandma roars in anger as she calls an Uber. 30 minutes later, Grandma walks into her house. Grandma roars like Godzilla when Thomas explains why he blew up every room in the house. Grandma screams like a god when she walks into her bedroom. 10 seconds later, Thomas and Grandma walk to the Tesla. Soon Grandma finishes repairing her Tesla. Soon Grandma's house collapses. Soon Grandma and Thomas get into the Tesla. 3 seconds later, Grandma speeds off to her skyscraper. End of story. Episode 3. Grandma's Mansion. Plot: it is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. In Grandma's mansion, it is very loud. Thomas is having a turmoil freak out. Grandma is busy calling the SWAT to assist her. Soon Thomas calms down. 2 seconds later, Grandma roars in anger when she sees the abject conditions of her house. Soon Grandma takes out an electric eel. Grandma roars in anger. A few seconds later, Thomas screams in pain. 10 minutes later, Grandma finishes whipping Thomas. Soon Thomas screams in anger as Grandma walks out to her tool shed. 3 minutes later, Grandma drives off to a hardware store. 10 seconds later, Thomas runs after Grandma. Soon Grandma speeds onto a highway. Thomas walks home. 8 minutes later, Thomas runs inside the house. Soon Thomas inhales an entire bottle of melatonin. 3 seconds later, Thomas languishes all his energy as he falls onto the kitchen counter. Soon Grandma walks into the hardware store. Back at Grandma's mansion, Thomas wakes up. Soon he walks to a construction site. 10 minutes later, Thomas hijacks a bulldozer. Soon he drives it back to Grandma's mansion. 10 minutes later, Thomas begins to raise Grandma's mansion. He forgets to think about the dire consequences of his actions. Back at the hardware store, Grandma is purchasing multiple tools to help discipline Thomas. Soon Grandma pays for the tools and drives home. 5 minutes later, Grandma pulls onto the street where her mansion is. A few seconds later, Grandma pulls up to her mansion. Grandma gets out of her Bugatti. Soon she roars in anger when she sees Thomas raising her mansion with a bulldozer. Soon Grandma walks to grab Thomas. 3 seconds later, Thomas runs away. Soon Thomas hijacks Grandma's Bugatti. 8 seconds later, Thomas speeds off with Grandma's Bugatti. Soon Grandma runs after Thomas. 10 minutes later, Grandma picks up Thomas. A few seconds later, Grandma walks home while dragging Thomas by the tail. 15 minutes later, Grandma walks into her shed full of rusted up tools from the year 1957. Soon Grandma locks the shed up. A few seconds later, Thomas screams in pain as Grandma beats him with a rusty. End of story. Episode 4. Thomas does the dishes. Plot. Thomas is raging in his bedroom. Soon Grandma walks into Thomas's bedroom. Grandma screams at Thomas. Grandma then rips apart Thomas's headset. Thomas roars at Grandma. A few seconds later, Grandma drags Thomas downstairs. Soon Thomas rips open the dishwasher. Half a second later, Grandma tells Thomas to be gentle. 1 second later, Thomas hisses at Grandma. Grandma roars at Thomas. Soon Thomas throws a dish into the dishwasher. Grandma roars at Thomas for misbehaving. Soon Thomas yeets a dish out of the kitchen window. 3 seconds later, Thomas starts throwing every dish in the sink to the floor. Grandma breathes in. Soon she turns electric red. 2 seconds later, Thomas runs for his life. Soon Thomas hijacks Grandma's SUV. A few seconds later, Thomas speeds off. Soon Grandma explodes. 10 seconds later, Grandma runs outside. Soon Grandma roars like King Ghidorah. Soon Thomas drives home. 2 minutes later, Thomas drives over Grandma. Thomas then speeds off to his top secret bunker. Grandma gets up. Soon Grandma opens a tracker app. 10 seconds later, Grandma chases Thomas. 2 minutes later, Grandma spanks Thomas for his behavior. A few minutes later, Grandma and Thomas drive home. 30 seconds later, Grandma drags Thomas inside. Soon Grandma slaps Thomas. Thomas escapes and runs for life. Half a second later, Grandma beats the poo-poo out of Thomas. 10 minutes later, Grandma stomps into the kitchen. 3 minutes later, Grandma dumps 120 F water on Thomas. Half a second later, Thomas screams like a god. A minute later, Thomas pushes Grandma to the floor. 1 second later, Grandma painfully slams onto the floor. 3 seconds later, Grandma gets up. Soon Grandma chases Thomas. 3 minutes later, Thomas gets decapitated. End of story. Episode 5. Chuck E. Cheese's outing gone wrong. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas and Grandma are speeding to Chuck E. Cheese's for an outing and lunch. A few minutes later, Grandma and Thomas walk into the Chuck E. Cheese's. A minute later, Grandma and Thomas order 2 pizzas. 10 minutes later, they sit at a table. A few seconds later, Thomas grabs the 2 pizzas. A few seconds later, Thomas starts to shove 16 slices of pizza down his throat. A few seconds later, Grandma grabs 1 slice. Thomas then hisses at Grandma. Grandma hands the slice back to Thomas. 2 minutes later, Thomas speeds away after forcing 4 pounds of pizza down his throat. A few seconds later, Thomas purchases $23 worth of tokens. A minute later, Thomas speed off to the arcade. A few seconds later, Thomas starts mass playing arcade games for tickets. 6 minutes later, Thomas runs out of tickets. Thomas then exchanges his tickets into a slip of paper. A few minutes later, Thomas arrives at the prize shop. Thomas says he wants the 60,000 ticket VR headset. Thomas then gets told he only has 385 tickets. Thomas screams at the top of his lungs. 4 seconds later, Thomas speeds to the car. A minute later, Thomas runs back into the Chuck E. Cheese's with a steel baseball bat. Thomas then starts smashing up the arcade games. A minute later, Grandma takes off her noise-cancelling headphones. Less than half a second later, Grandma hears smashing sounds and patrons screaming. Grandma gets up. A few seconds later, Grandma locates Thomas smashing the token machine. Grandma then speeds over. A few seconds later, Grandma drags Thomas out of the Chuck E. Cheese. A minute later, they speed home. A few minutes later, Grandma grounds Thomas for a few centuries. Episode 6. Thomas's house fire. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Grandma is cooking lunch for herself and Thomas. Thomas is upstairs mega raging at his Xbox. A few seconds later, Grandma hears a very loud curse word. Grandma then screams with pure anger. 8 seconds later, Grandma turns the internet router off. Grandma then walks back to the kitchen. A few seconds later, Thomas lets out a very loud screech when he disconnects from his video game. 8 seconds later, Thomas stomps downstairs. 30 seconds later, Thomas roars at Grandma because she turned the router off. Grandma tells Thomas he was being too loud. Thomas then walks away. Grandma tells Thomas they are having meatballs for lunch. Thomas runs into the dining room. A few seconds later, Grandma serves several mini meatballs to Thomas. Thomas then screams. Grandma tells Thomas to shut up. A few seconds later, Thomas storms away. A few seconds later, Thomas slams the front door closed as he storms to the shed. A minute later, Thomas grabs a flamethrower. A few seconds later, Grandma sprints outside. 10 seconds later, Thomas lights Grandma's wooden deck on fire. A minute later, Thomas watches the fire spread to the house. 3 seconds later, Grandma starts exploding at Thomas. A minute later, Grandma calls the fire department. 8 minutes later, the fire starts to get put out. 10 minutes later, the house fire is put out. Grandma and Thomas then get into Grandma's car. A minute later, they speed away. The end. Episode 7. The Vacation Nightmare. Plot. It is a peaceful spring evening in Manila, Philippines. Grandma and Thomas are speeding to their hotel. 8 minutes later Grandma checks in. A few minutes later they park. 3 minutes later Grandma and Thomas walk into their hotel family suite. A few seconds later they start to unpack. 10 minutes later they head to sleep. 6 hours later Grandma and Thomas wake up. A few seconds later they walk into the kitchen. A few seconds later Grandma cooks breakfast. Thomas watches TV on his mobile phone. 10 minutes later Grandma and Thomas tuck into some parfait with cold cereal. Thomas then screams with pure anger when he tastes his parfait. A few seconds later Grandma watches Thomas storm off with his bowl of parfait. 10 seconds later Thomas chucks his bowl off the 18th floor. A minute later Grandma roars at Thomas. Thomas then walks to his bedroom. A few seconds later Thomas throws a TV off the deck for no reason. Grandma then screams at Thomas. A few seconds later Thomas screeches at Grandma. Thomas then takes out a stick of dynamite. 2 minutes later Thomas blows up the deck. Half a second later the entire hotel shakes violently. A minute later Thomas lights Grandma's clothes on fire. A minute later Grandma and Thomas run away. A few seconds later the fire alarms go off. Then the entire hotel starts to evacuate. A few minutes later Thomas and Grandma speed away at speeds of 82 miles per hour. A few seconds later Thomas punches Grandma's jaw. Thomas then dives out of the car. A few seconds later the car crashes into a tree. A minute later Grandma picks up Thomas. 8 seconds later 28 police cars arrive at the crash site. 10 seconds later Grandma gets arrested. End of story. Episode 8. Thomas's peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich meltdown and fire. Plot. It is a peaceful winter afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas speeding home from their weekly grocery store trip with a trunk overflowing with bags. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas start bringing the bags in. 4 minutes later Thomas speeds upstairs while Grandma begins to put away the groceries. 18 minutes later Grandma finishes the groceries. She then starts to prepare a peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich for Thomas. A few minutes later Thomas wanders into the kitchen. A minute later Grandma serves the sandwich to Thomas. Thomas takes the sandwich apart. He then sees Grandma put hot Cheetos, pickles, Smarties, frosted flakes, pulled pork, spaghetti and a little bit of every seasoning they own onto the sandwich. Thomas then roars at Grandma. Grandma tells Thomas that he better eat the sandwich or there would be heck to pay. Thomas then grabs a fork. A few seconds later Thomas starts stabbing the sandwich. A minute later Thomas grabs a bottle of lighter fluid and some towels. Thomas then grabs a box of matches. A few seconds later Thomas storms away. A minute later Grandma screams with all her might while she watches Thomas torch the monstrosity of a sandwich. Thomas then laughs like a maniac. Grandma then grabs a bucket. A minute later Grandma douses the fire. A few seconds later Thomas and Grandma walk into the house. Thomas then gets nagged at for torching his lunch. Grandma then shoots Thomas's rear end with a BB gun. Thomas then yelps in pain. A few seconds later Thomas slaps Grandma's ear. A few seconds later Thomas grabs an ice pack for his rear end. Thomas then runs upstairs crying like the spoiled brat he is. Episode 9. Thomas goes to school. Plot. It is a peaceful autumn morning in Utica, New York. Grandma is yelling at Thomas because he isn't ready and his school bus is waiting. A minute later Thomas gets onto the school bus. 40 minutes later Thomas walks into his school. A minute later Thomas walks into his pre-algebra class. A minute later Thomas gets a massive work booklet. Thomas glances through his booklet. A few seconds later Thomas screams very loudly. A few seconds later Thomas rips his massive booklet apart. A minute later Thomas's teacher tells Thomas to go to the principal's office. Thomas grunts with anger. A few seconds later Thomas grabs a golf club from his backpack. Thomas then storms away. Thomas then walks to the principal's office while smashing everything in sight. A few minutes later Thomas arrives at the main office after he smashed up everything in sight. A few seconds later Thomas walks into the principal's office. The principal and Grandma start roaring at Thomas for his walk of destruction. A few seconds later Thomas starts to smash up the principal's office. Grandma then tackles Thomas. A few seconds later Grandma chains down Thomas to a chair. A few seconds later the principal tells Grandma that Thomas is expelled. A few seconds later Grandma unchains Thomas. A minute later Grandma chains Thomas to a shopping cart. A few minutes later Grandma ties the shopping cart to the SUV with a single rope. Grandma then tells Thomas he will be dragged behind the SUV. All the way home, Thomas screams very loudly. A minute later Grandma powers up the SUV. A few seconds later Grandma revs the engine. 10 seconds later Grandma and Thomas speed home. 18 minutes later Grandma parks the SUV in front of the house. A few seconds later Grandma sees a trail of blood and chunks of Thomas's organs behind her SUV. The end. Episode 10. Grandma's Nap and Punishment Day. Plot. It is a peaceful spring afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma is nagging Thomas that she wakes up from her nap from his raging. There would be heck to pay. Grandma is taking a short nap. Thomas is raging his brains out at his Xbox. A few seconds later Thomas lets out a colossal roar. A minute later Grandma opens her eyelids. A few seconds later Thomas starts cursing like a sailor. Grandma then throws her blanket to the floor. A few seconds later Grandma walks into Thomas's bedroom. Grandma then tells Thomas he is getting a brutal punishment day. A few seconds later Thomas speeds downstairs. A minute later Thomas hijacks Grandma's SUV. A few seconds later Grandma drags Thomas out of her SUV. A second later Grandma reads out a list of 3 brutal and deadly punishments. Thomas screams with horror when Grandma tells Thomas that he is getting a dry ice bath. A few seconds later Grandma drags Thomas inside against his will. A minute later Thomas gets put into his dry ice bath. A few seconds later Thomas starts screeching in pain. An hour later Thomas is finally given permission to exit the tub. A few seconds later Grandma drags Thomas to their hot tub. A minute later Grandma throws Thomas into the hot tub. A few seconds later Thomas roars with pain. A few minutes later Thomas gets let out of the hot tub. A few seconds later Thomas is forced to dry off with a cactus. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas walk into the house. A minute later Grandma pushes Thomas down the stairs. 2 seconds later Thomas slams face first into a cement wall. A few seconds later Grandma tells Thomas the punishment day is over. The end. Episode 11. Thomas and the boat. Plot. It is a peaceful spring morning in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are getting into a cab for a trip down to NYC. A few minutes later they speed off. A few hours later Grandma and Thomas get out at a pier. Capital A. Few minutes later they get onto their boat. A few seconds later Thomas and Grandma get ready for an afternoon on the sea. A few minutes later Grandma starts driving the boat. A few seconds later Thomas starts getting seasick. A minute later Thomas baths into the ocean. Grandma then stops driving. A few seconds later Grandma tells Thomas to clean it up. Grandma then resumes driving. A few seconds later Grandma throws Thomas a bucket and mop. Thomas then rips the mop in half. A few seconds later Thomas starts hitting the engine with a broken mop. A few seconds later Grandma watches her engine cease to work. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas now realize they are stranded in the middle of a super busy stretch of water on a small and cramped 3-room houseboat. A few seconds later Thomas gets slapped across his rear end. Thomas then drills a hole into the poop deck. Grandma then roars with anger as she watches water start flooding the poop deck. A few minutes later Grandma's $84,000 houseboat starts sinking. Grandma then starts crying. Thomas then lights up a flare. A minute later they put on life vests. 8 minutes later the boat disappears under the water. 80 minutes later they finally get rescued. A few seconds later Grandma punches Thomas. A minute later Grandma tells the captain to speed away without Thomas. A few seconds later the boat speeds away. Thomas then dies from hypothermia. Episode 12. Grandma's new mattress. Plot. It is a peaceful winter afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are speeding off to Jordan's Furniture because Grandma wants a new mattress to replace her lumpy one she currently has. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas walk into the Jordan's Furniture. A few seconds later Thomas and Grandma sprint to the mattress section. A minute later Grandma and a worker start finding the perfect mattress for Grandma with a bridge. A few minutes later they find the perfect mattress for Grandma. A few seconds later Grandma, Thomas and the worker try to locate Grandma's mattress. A minute later they find it. Grandma then pays for it. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas walk back to Grandma's Lamborghini. A few minutes later they speed home. 8 minutes later Grandma walks into the house. An hour later a Jordan's Furniture truck delivers Grandma's brand new mattress. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas start bringing the mattress upstairs. 10 minutes later Grandma and Thomas start to replace Grandma's mattress. An hour later Thomas and Grandma drag Grandma's 72-year-old mattress outside. A few minutes later they put the mattress in their shed. A few minutes later Grandma lays down on her mattress for a test nap. Grandma instantly falls asleep. A minute later Thomas starts axing Grandma's $1,529 mattress. A few seconds later Grandma wakes up. Grandma then screams with all her might. A few seconds later Grandma slaps Thomas. Thomas then runs away. A few seconds later Grandma starts crying because she can't have anything nice. A few seconds later Thomas shoots Grandma's rear end with a BB gun. 8 seconds later Grandma turns Thomas into a pretzel. Grandma then falls asleep on her axed up mattress. End of story. Episode 13. Grandma's Xbox fire. Plot. It is a peaceful afternoon day in Utica, New York. Thomas is raging at his Xbox and Grandma is cooking dinner. A few minutes later Grandma starts to hear curse words coming from Thomas's oversized mouth. A few seconds later Grandma calls for Thomas because dinner is ready. Thomas ignores Grandma. Grandma keeps calling for Thomas, but she gets no response. A minute later Thomas finally comes downstairs. Thomas and Grandma then walk into the kitchen. A few seconds later Grandma serves Thomas the food she made. A few seconds later Thomas screams very loudly when he sees Grandma cooked her infamous squid surprise. Thomas then smashes his squid surprise on the floor. A few seconds later Grandma roars with all her might. A few seconds later Grandma storms upstairs. 20 seconds later Grandma walks outside with Thomas's Xbox. A few seconds later Grandma grabs fire starting materials. A few seconds later Grandma squirts lighter fluid onto the Xbox. A few seconds later Grandma torches a towel. 8 seconds later Grandma places the flaming towel onto the Xbox. A few seconds later Thomas strolls outside when Grandma pours gasoline onto the flaming towel. Thomas screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Grandma laughs like a maniac. Thomas then grabs a bucket. A few seconds later Thomas douses the fire. Thomas then starts bawling his eyes out. Grandma tells Thomas to grow up. Grandma and Thomas then walk inside. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas walk upstairs. A minute later Grandma falls asleep. A few seconds later Thomas watches TV. 8 minutes later Thomas falls asleep. The end. Episode 14. Thomas blows the house up. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Grandma is speeding home from the grocery store with a SUV flooded with $800 of groceries. Thomas is mega raging at his Xbox. A few minutes later Thomas hears Grandma's SUV pull up into the driveway. A few seconds later Thomas speeds outside. A minute later Grandma and Thomas begin to bring in the groceries. A few minutes later Grandma asks Thomas to help put the groceries away. Thomas sprints away. 3 seconds later Thomas speeds upstairs. Grandma sighs. A second later Grandma begins to put the groceries away. 10 minutes later Grandma calls for Thomas. Thomas then cusses Grandma out. Grandma screams very loudly. 3 seconds later Grandma turns the router off. Grandma then walks to her SUV. A few seconds later Thomas disconnects from his Xbox. Thomas then stomps downstairs. A few seconds later Thomas screeches with excitement when Grandma speeds off somewhere. A minute later Thomas drags a box of dynamite downstairs from his bedroom. 10 minutes later Thomas finishes setting up the dynamite sticks and wiring. A few seconds later Thomas walks outside with the fuse box. Thomas then sets up the fuse box. A minute later Thomas does the final checks to see if everything is ready. A few minutes later Thomas sets up in a safe area with his fuse box. 10 minutes later Thomas hears Grandma's SUV driving up their street. Thomas then watches Grandma's SUV come into view. A few seconds later Thomas ignites the fuse box. 10 seconds later all the TNT blows up the house and some of the neighboring houses and the road and some of the pipes and telephone wires. Grandma parks her SUV. Grandma then wanders over to the explosion site. Grandma then roars with all her might when she sees the house was blown up. Thomas then comes out of nowhere. Grandma then roars at Thomas. Thomas comes clean and admits that he threw the neighborhood into turmoil. A few seconds later Grandma rips Thomas's skull off of his spine. Thomas then dies. The end. Episode 15. Thomas's chore day disaster. Plot. It is a peaceful summer afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma is nagging at Thomas about doing a chore list. Thomas grabs the chore list. A few seconds later Grandma walks out to her Tesla. A few seconds later Grandma gets into her Tesla. A minute later Grandma speed off to get some errands done. A few seconds later Thomas drinks an entire bottle of melatonin. A few seconds later Thomas crashes onto the kitchen counter. 2 hours later Thomas wakes up. A few seconds later Thomas reads out a text from Grandma. Thomas then screams when he sees that Grandma is 10 minutes away from the house. Thomas screams with pure anger. Thomas then sees he has to wash his cat bed, do the laundry, do the dishes, cut the grass, tidy up the house and take a shower. Thomas then speeds into the kitchen. A few seconds later Thomas starts smashing dishes everywhere. A few seconds later Thomas starts throwing dishes into the dishwasher. 2 minutes later Thomas pours 26 gallons of dish soap into the dishwasher. A few seconds later Thomas starts a cycle on the dishwasher. 8 seconds later Thomas walks into the bathroom to wash the laundry. A few seconds later Thomas blows up the washer and dryer. Thomas then rips apart all the dirty clothes. A few seconds later Thomas sprints upstairs with construction tools. 3 minutes later Thomas walks downstairs after destroying Grandma's bedroom. A minute later Thomas starts cutting the grass. A minute later Thomas torches the lawnmower for no reason. A few seconds later Thomas starts smashing everything in the house. 4 minutes later Thomas hears Grandma's Tesla pull into the driveway. Thomas then puts up a barricade with the couch against the back door. Thomas then sees a flood is almost at the back door. A few seconds later Grandma walks up to the back door. Thomas freaks out. He then starts smashing the electronic devices. A few seconds later Grandma opens the door. A second later Grandma starts dragging the couch outside. A minute later Grandma sees soapy water is flooding out of the back door. Grandma roars with pure anger. A second later Grandma walks inside. She then hears smashing sounds. A few seconds later Thomas finishes smashing up Grandma's office. A few seconds later Grandma starts exploring the wasteland of destruction in her house. A minute later Grandma picks up Thomas. A few seconds later Grandma drags Thomas outside. A few seconds later Grandma drags Thomas into her beating shed. A few seconds later Grandma closes the shed doors. The end. Episode 16. Grandma's Temper Tantrum. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is peacefully watching TV. A few minutes later Thomas walks into the house after a long day of school. A few seconds later Thomas walks upstairs. A minute later Thomas starts screaming at his Xbox. Grandma then gets up. A few seconds later Grandma walks to the John. 3 minutes later Grandma resumes watching TV. A minute later Grandma screams when she gets a commercial. A few seconds later Grandma walks to the kitchen. A few seconds later Grandma starts smashing the food up. A minute later Thomas walks downstairs. A few seconds later Thomas asks for dinner. Grandma throws Thomas into the living room. Thomas then runs upstairs. A few seconds later Grandma starts screaming very loudly. Grandma then starts pickaxing the living room TV for no reason. A few minutes later Grandma torches the living room TV. Thomas then smells smoke. A few seconds later Thomas walks outside. Grandma then gets into her SUV. A few seconds later Grandma runs over Thomas. A minute later Thomas gets up. A few seconds later Grandma screams very loudly. Grandma then smashes the pool liner for no reason. Half a second later a flood of cool water gushes into the street. A few seconds later Grandma walks inside. Grandma then blows up the toilet with several cherry bombs. A few moments later Thomas starts raging at his Xbox. A minute later Thomas watches Grandma destroy everything in his bedroom. A few seconds later Grandma pushes Thomas down the stairs. A few seconds later Thomas crashes into a chair. A few seconds later Grandma destroys her glass figurine case for no reason. 8 seconds later Grandma crashes onto the couch and passes out from exhaustion. The end. Episode 17. Thomas's Tractor Joyride. Plot. It is a peaceful morning in Utica, New York. Thomas and Grandma are speeding to Thomas's high school. A few minutes later Thomas walks into his pre-calculus class. A few seconds later Thomas asks his teacher if he can be excused to use the restroom. The teacher gives Thomas the green light. Thomas then speeds out with his backpack. 3 minutes later Thomas grabs the keys to the groundskeeper's tractor. A minute later Thomas drives the tractor onto the streets of Utica, New York. A few minutes later Thomas arrives at a Burger King. Thomas then drives the tractor into the Burger King. A few seconds later Thomas resumes driving, with a parade of police cars chasing him. Meanwhile at Grandma's house, Grandma is watching TV. She then turns on the CNN news channel. A few seconds later Grandma watches in horror as a reporter starts covering Thomas's slow speed pursuit. A few seconds later Grandma turns the TV off. A minute later Grandma speeds off in her Bugatti. A few minutes later Grandma spots the parade of police cars. Grandma then starts following the 28 police cars. A few hours later the tractor runs out of gas. Thomas then runs into a forest. A minute later Grandma sprints after Thomas and 53 police officers. A few minutes later Thomas gets arrested. A few minutes later Grandma and the police cars drive to a police station. 8 minutes later Thomas gets thrown into a jail cell. A few minutes later Grandma pays for Thomas's $482,528 bail. A few seconds later Thomas and Grandma speed off. An hour later Thomas gets thrown out of the Bugatti. Grandma then speeds off into the night sky, leaving Thomas stranded in Pennsylvania. Episode 18. Thomas's Restaurant Incident. Plot. It is a peaceful evening in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are peacefully watching TV. A few seconds later Thomas tells Grandma that he wants to eat at Uno's for dinner. Grandma thinks it is a swell idea. A minute later they speed off to a Uno's. 10 minutes later they walk into a Uno's. A few seconds later they get served a table. A few minutes later they order their beverages. A few seconds later Thomas goes to the soup bar. A few seconds later Thomas starts chugging the broccoli cheddar soup. A minute later Thomas walks back to the table. Thomas and Grandma then order their entrees. A few seconds later Thomas tucks into some appetizers. 20 minutes later Thomas roars with pure anger because he wants his cheeseburger. 10 minutes later a waiter brings out Grandma's meal. Thomas then roars with all his might. A few minutes later Thomas is given his cheeseburger. A few seconds later Thomas shoves the entire burger down his throat without chewing. A few seconds later Thomas asks for seconds. Thomas then grabs Grandma's meal. A few seconds later Grandma slaps Thomas silly. A few seconds later Thomas sprints outside. Grandma then eats her meal in peace and quiet. A minute later Thomas grabs a flamethrower from Grandma's SUV. A minute later Thomas starts to torch every car in the Uno's parking lot. A few minutes later everyone in the Unos run outside. A few seconds later Grandma watches Thomas walk into the Unos with his flamethrower. A few minutes later Thomas walks outside. A few seconds later the Unos begins to collapse. Everyone then runs for cover. A few seconds later the Unos collapses. Grandma then decapitates Thomas by ripping his skull clean off his neck. Episode 19. Grandma purchases a convenience store. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are at a convenience store. Grandma is putting in the final payment so she can purchase it from the owner. A few minutes later Grandma finishes the paperwork. She is then given the keys and deed to the store. A few seconds later the former owner walks out. Grandma then hires Thomas as a cashier, janitor, stoker, delivery boy, customer service representative and a mascot. Thomas screams with pure anger. Thomas then gets informed he will be working every day from 8 in the morning to 10 at night. Grandma then tells Thomas he isn't getting paid. A few seconds later Grandma walks away to the back. A minute later Karen comes to the register. Karen starts criticizing Thomas because he is a cat. A few seconds later Thomas tells Karen to bleep off. Karen then yells for the owner. Grandma runs outside. A few seconds later Karen tells Grandma that Thomas was rude. Grandma then assists the Karen. A few minutes later Grandma walks back to her office. A minute later Karen hands Thomas a shopping basket full of goods. Thomas then starts scanning and bagging the goods. 4 minutes later Karen hands Thomas a pile of expired coupons. Thomas then explains the coupons are expired. Karen then calls for Grandma. Grandma speeds to the register. A few seconds later Karen explains the situation. A minute later Karen walks away with her bags. Grandma then yells at Thomas for inappropriately handling the situation. Thomas then slaps Grandma. A few seconds later Grandma walks outside. Thomas then takes out some TNT from his underpants. A few seconds later Thomas runs outside. 3 seconds later the convenience store explodes. Grandma then kills Thomas with a massive punch. The end. Episode 20. Thomas's grocery store shopping cart freakout and punishment. Plot. It is a peaceful afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are speeding to the grocery store in Grandma's SUV. A few minutes later Thomas and Grandma walk into a market basket. 10 seconds later Thomas speeds off with a shopping cart. A minute later Grandma starts shopping via her grocery list. 10 minutes later Thomas smashes into a stranger's cart while running 13 miles per hour. Half a second later the carts fall over and groceries fly and explode everywhere. Grandma then walks into the aisle where the collision happened. A few seconds later Grandma screams at Thomas for causing a crash. A few seconds later Thomas pushes over Grandma's shopping cart. Half a second later Grandma's shopping cart crashes onto the floor, causing food and liquid to go everywhere. A minute later Thomas and Grandma speed home. 3 minutes later Grandma and Thomas walk into the house. A few seconds later Grandma tells Thomas he is getting a brutal punishment. Thomas screams super loudly. A few seconds later Thomas gets dragged outside against his will. A few seconds later Grandma chains down Thomas to a chair. A minute later Grandma slams Thomas's PS5 onto the street. 2 minutes later Grandma torches the Xbox. A few seconds later Thomas screams very loudly. A second later the police arrive at Grandma's house. A few seconds later Thomas gets unchained while Grandma is arrested. Then the fire is put out. A few seconds later Thomas is arrested for his grocery store freakout. A minute later they are driven to a court. A few minutes later their trial begins. 3 hours later Grandma and Thomas are sentenced to be hanged. A few years later Grandma and Thomas are hanged to death. The end. Episode 21. Grandma blows up Thomas's bedroom. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas is mega raging at his Xbox. Grandma is cooking lunch for Thomas. 3 minutes later Grandma calls for Thomas. Thomas ignores Grandma. A few seconds later Thomas walks downstairs. A minute later Grandma hands Thomas some mac and cheese pulled pork. Thomas screams at the top of his lungs. A few seconds later Thomas throws his lunch out of the kitchen window. A few seconds later Thomas walks back upstairs. A few seconds later Grandma walks outside. A minute later she speeds off to a weapon shop. 20 minutes later Grandma walks back into the house with a paper bag. A few seconds later Grandma walks upstairs. A minute later Grandma takes out some C4. A few seconds later Thomas runs downstairs. 8 seconds later Grandma charges the C4. 2 seconds later Grandma runs downstairs. A minute later Thomas's bedroom explodes. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas walk back upstairs. A few seconds later Thomas hisses as Grandma. Grandma then walks away. A few seconds later Thomas blows up Grandma's bedroom as revenge. Grandma then feels the entire house shake. 2 seconds later Grandma speeds upstairs. A few seconds later Grandma sees the state of the upstairs. Grandma then screams when she sees half the house was blown to smithereens. A few seconds later Thomas gets picked up. 8 seconds later Grandma drags Thomas outside by his tail. A minute later they speed off somewhere. 3 hours later Grandma throws Thomas onto a plane. Then the plane takes off. A few seconds later the pilot says they are going to Japan. Thomas screams at the top of his lungs. A few hours later Thomas lands in Japan. A week later Thomas walks back into the house. A few seconds later Grandma rips Thomas's spine out of his back. The end. Episode 22. Skyscraper explosion. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in New York City, New York. Grandma and Thomas are eating lunch on the 82nd floor in Grandma's skyscraper. A few minutes later Thomas is forced to wash the dirty dishes from breakfast. Thomas screams with pure anger. Grandma then tells Thomas the dishwasher is broken. Thomas then walks to the dishwashing room. A few seconds later Thomas sneaks to his bedroom. A few minutes later Thomas arrives at his bedroom. A few seconds later Thomas finds a box of C4. Thomas then runs up to the dish room. 2 minutes later Thomas places the C4 pieces around the dishwashing room. 10 minutes later Thomas ignites the C4. A minute later Thomas runs to the streets of NYC. A few seconds later Grandma hears ticking. Grandma then puts a jetpack on. A few seconds later Grandma jumps out of a window. A few seconds later Thomas sprints away from the ticking time bomb. A minute later the C4 explodes, causing Grandma's skyscraper to collapse. A few minutes later Grandma finds Thomas boarding a train. A few seconds later Grandma chases the train with her jetpack. A minute later Grandma boards the train via an emergency hatch on the ceiling of a train car. A few seconds later, Grandma finds Thomas hiding in a suitcase. Thomas then gets taken out of the suitcase. A few seconds later, Thomas and Grandma get into a massive brawl. A few minutes later, Thomas grabs the jetpack. A few seconds later, Thomas flies away, leaving Grandma stranded. A few seconds later, Grandma opens an app on her phone. A minute later, Grandma initiates the self-destruct button on the jetpack. A few seconds later, Thomas and the jetpack explode and cease to exist. The end. Episode 23. Thomas's report card. Plot. It is a peaceful fall afternoon in Utica, New York. Thomas is in his 9th period class. A few seconds later, Thomas gets his report card. Thomas then sees he got 0% in every class, including lunch. A few minutes later, Thomas gets into Grandma's SUV. A minute later, Grandma speed home. 3 minutes later, Thomas and Grandma walk into the house. A few seconds later, Thomas hands Grandma his report card. A few seconds later, Grandma nags Thomas for failing lunch. 2 minutes later, Violet grabs a BB gun. A few seconds later, Grandma shoots Thomas's booty. Thomas yelps in pain. A few seconds later, Grandma walks outside with Thomas's Nintendo Switch. 2 minutes later, Grandma torches the Switch. A few seconds later, Thomas blows up Grandma's house. Then Grandma grabs a chainsaw. A few seconds later, Grandma turns the chainsaw on. 3 seconds later, Grandma decapitates Thomas. The end. Episode 24. Thomas's grocery store incident. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are walking into a market basket. A few seconds later, Grandma and Thomas part ways after grabbing grocery carts. 10 minutes later, Thomas meets up with Grandma at the checkout. A few seconds later, Grandma roars at Thomas for filling 2 shopping carts with nothing but junk food. Grandma then says she isn't paying for the food. Thomas screams at the top of his lungs. A few seconds later, Thomas pushes over his grocery carts. A few seconds later, Grandma's cart gets pushed over by Thomas the troublesome cat. Grandma then roars her head off. Grandma then grabs a shopping cart. A minute later, Grandma chains Thomas to a shopping cart. A few minutes later, Grandma ties the shopping cart to the SUV with a single rope. Grandma then tells Thomas he will be dragged behind the SUV. All the way home, Thomas screams very loudly. A minute later, Grandma powers up the SUV. A few seconds later, Grandma revs the engine. 10 seconds later, Grandma and Thomas speed home. 18 minutes later, Grandma parks the SUV in front of the house. A few seconds later, Grandma sees a trail of blood and chunks of Thomas's organs behind her SUV. The end. Episode 26. Goodbye Grandma's Garden. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas is helping Grandma with some garden work. A few seconds later, Thomas rakes a pile of leaves incorrectly. Grandma then slaps Thomas for his choice. Grandma then focuses her attention on ripping weeds out of the ground. A few seconds later, Thomas grabs the lawnmower. A few seconds later, Thomas starts mowing Grandma's bed of carrots. 3 seconds later, Grandma snaps at Thomas. Thomas then lights up some C4. Grandma runs away. A few seconds later, Thomas blows up Grandma's garden bed. 1 second later, Grandma grabs a chainsaw. 2 seconds later, Grandma turns it on. A few seconds later, Grandma starts chasing Thomas with the chainsaw. The end. Episode 27. Thomas and the Hornet's Nest. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas is napping outside on a lawn chair. A few seconds later, Grandma tells Thomas he needs to take care of their hornet's nest. Thomas then sighs. A few seconds later, Thomas grabs a flamethrower. Grandma then runs away. A few seconds later, Thomas torches the hornet's nest. 2 seconds later, 300 hornets fly out of the nest. A few seconds later, the hornets start mass stinging Thomas. A minute later, Thomas passes away. The end. Episode 28. Thomas ruins Grandma's 4th of July party. Plot. It is a peaceful summer evening in Utica, New York. Grandma is welcoming guests into her house for her 4th of July party. A few seconds later, Thomas starts flirting with a teenager. A few seconds later, the teenager slaps Thomas. Grandma then scolds Thomas for his behavior. 1 minute later, Thomas starts dancing like a nut job. 3 seconds later, Thomas walks into the kitchen. 2 seconds later, Thomas starts throwing the snacks that Grandma prepared to the floor. 1 minute later, Thomas starts smashing up the dinner. 30 seconds later, Grandma walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later, Thomas slaps Grandma, while he dances like a complete idiot. Grandma then drags Thomas to the living room. A few seconds later, Thomas explains to the party guests why there won't be any food. The party guests then leave. A minute later, Thomas runs up to his bedroom. The end. Episode 29. Grandma's Mansion Fire. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas and Grandma are speeding towards Grandma's mansion because Thomas blew up Grandma's house. 10 minutes later, Thomas and Grandma walk into the mansion. A few seconds later, Thomas speeds upstairs to his bedroom. 2 minutes later, Grandma turns the internet router off. A few seconds later, Thomas grabs a flamethrower from his arson chest. A few seconds later, Thomas torches his bedroom. Thomas then runs outside. A few seconds later, Grandma chases Thomas. A minute later, the fire explodes and spreads throughout the mansion. A few seconds later, the mansion collapses. 8 seconds later, Grandma rips Thomas's skull off his spine. The end. Episode 30. Thomas hijacks an ice cream truck. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas is outside waiting with several children for the daily visit from the ice cream truck. Capital A. Few minutes later, Thomas spots the ice cream truck. A few seconds later, Thomas gets into the truck. Half a second later, Thomas pushes the ice cream worker out of his truck. A minute later, Thomas speeds off with the stolen ice cream truck. 10 minutes later, Thomas crashes the truck into a ditch. 3 minutes later, Thomas gets arrested. The end. Episode 31. Grandma and the blowtorch incident and fire. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Grandma is napping on the couch. A few seconds later, Grandma wakes up from Thomas's incessant and ignorant raging. A few seconds later, Grandma walks upstairs. A minute later, Grandma walks outside with a blowtorch and Thomas's Xbox. 2 minutes later, Grandma torches Thomas's Xbox with her blowtorch. Thomas then starts dousing the fire. 10 seconds later, the fire is fully doused. 3 seconds later, Grandma shoots Thomas's stomach. The end. Episode 32. Thomas's April Fool's Mischief. Plot. It is a peaceful April Fool's morning in Utica, New York. Grandma is peacefully sleeping. A few minutes later, Grandma wakes up. A few seconds later, Grandma gets out of bed. 1 second later, Grandma jumps back onto her bed. A few seconds later Grandma sees a bucket of piranhas next to her bed. Grandma then knows it is April Fool's. A few seconds later Grandma walks downstairs. Half a second later Grandma trips on some tripwire. 3 seconds later Grandma painfully slams onto hardwood. 10 minutes later Grandma drives to a weapon shop. 40 minutes later Grandma walks into the house with 3 tote bags filled with weaponry. A few seconds later Grandma steps on a pressure plate. 1 second later hundreds of Thomas's pranks hit Grandma at once. 2 minutes later Grandma finds Thomas. 1 second later Grandma hits Thomas's skull with a 30-pound frying pan. The end. Episode 33. Grandma's Buffet Incident. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Thomas and Grandma are speeding to a buffet. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas get their beverages. A few seconds later Thomas speeds off to the food. A few minutes later Thomas returns to the table with 18 steamed trays. 10 seconds later Thomas starts forcing 82 pounds of food down his throat. 2 seconds later Grandma lights up some TNT. A few seconds later everyone evacuates. 2 minutes later the buffet explodes. The end. Episode 34. Grandma's yard sale gone wrong. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is setting up a yard sale to get rid of some things she no longer needs. Grandma then places Thomas's Xbox on a table with other items she plans on selling. A few minutes later the yard sale begins. 10 minutes later Thomas gets off of his school bus. A few seconds later Thomas sees his Xbox is for sale. For 1 penny. A few seconds later Thomas then knows he doesn't have a penny. A minute later Thomas screams with pure anger. 10 seconds later Thomas starts smashing up the yard sale. 10 seconds later Grandma rips Thomas's heart out of his chest. The end. Episode 35. Thomas's pool chaos. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Grandma is cleaning her pool. A few minutes later Thomas asks Grandma if they can swim. Grandma then hits Thomas with a mop. 1 second later Thomas is forced to mop the grass. A few seconds later Thomas rips his mop in half. 1 second later Grandma kicks Thomas into outer space. The end. Episode 36. Thomas's TV freakout. Plot. It is a peaceful spring evening in Utica, New York. Grandma is peacefully watching TV after a long day with Thomas's antics. A few seconds later Thomas asks Grandma if he can watch TV. Grandma then tells Thomas to watch TV in his bedroom. 1 second later Thomas says he wants to watch on the living room TV. 1 second later Grandma tells Thomas to bleep off. A few seconds later Thomas drags the TV outside. 12 seconds later Thomas throws the living room TV into their pool. The end. Episode 37. Grandma's new Bugatti. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are being Ubered to a Bugatti dealership because Thomas picked up Grandma's 2007 Bugatti Veyron. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas walk into the Bugatti dealership. 20 minutes later Grandma finds a 2009 Bugatti Veyron. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas test drive the Bugatti. 2 hours later Grandma finalizes some paperwork. A few seconds later Grandma is given the keys to her new used Bugatti. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas speed home. 2 minutes later Thomas pokes Grandma. A few seconds later Grandma accidentally drives her Bugatti into a tree. A few seconds later Grandma grabs a rusty knife from her glove compartment. A few seconds later Grandma. The end. Episode 38. Tesla fire. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas is raging his brains out at his Xbox. A few seconds later Grandma turns the internet router off. 10 seconds later Thomas walks outside with his flamethrower. 1 minute later Grandma's Tesla goes up in flames. A few seconds later Grandma eliminates Thomas. A minute later Grandma finishes dousing the fire. The end. Episode 39. Thomas's pencil rampage. Plot. It is a peaceful summer day in Utica, New York. Grandma is speeding home with school supplies for Thomas. 10 minutes later Grandma shouts for Thomas. 2 minutes later Grandma hands Thomas his bag of school supplies. 2 seconds later Thomas grabs a pack of 48 pencils. 2 seconds later Thomas starts raging while ripping the pencils in half. 10 seconds later Thomas starts throwing pencils at Grandma. 2 seconds later Thomas throws pencils everywhere in the living room. 10 minutes later Thomas stomps upstairs. The end. Episode 40. Thomas and the glass figurine case. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is cleaning her $600,000 glass figurine case. A few seconds later Thomas storms downstairs. 10 seconds later Grandma walks away to get some dusting supplies. 2 seconds later Thomas drags Grandma's figurine case outside for no reason. 1 minute later a massive fire engulfs the figurine case. 2 minutes later Grandma finishes dousing the fire. 2 seconds later Grandma decapitates Thomas with a katana. Episode 41. Thomas and the thunderstorm. Plot. It is a peaceful night in Utica, New York. Thomas is raging his brains out at his PS5. 1 minute later a massive thunder bangs. A few seconds later it starts downpouring. 3 seconds later lightning strikes the pool. Thomas then screams with all his might. A few seconds later Thomas hides under his security blanket for safety. 10 minutes later the thunderstorm gets worse. 2 minutes later Thomas starts praying for no reason. 10 minutes later the thunderstorm stops. 3 seconds later Thomas walks downstairs. A few seconds later Grandma sees Thomas is sweating bullets. Grandma then starts laughing her head off. A few minutes later Thomas and Grandma go to bed. The end. Episode 42. Thomas's power out meltdown. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas is raging his brains out at his Xbox. A few seconds later Grandma sighs because she is getting pissed off from Thomas's constant rage sessions. A minute later Grandma turns off the power in the house with the electrical fuse box in the basement. A few seconds later Thomas sees the power and internet turned off. 1 second later Thomas screams with all his might. 3 seconds later Thomas stomps downstairs. 3 minutes later Thomas lights up some C4. 1 minute later Grandma's house explodes. The end. Episode 43. Grandma's wedding disaster. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is getting ready for her wedding. Thomas is pouting in Grandma's SUV. A few seconds later Thomas grabs a block of TNT from his underpants. A few minutes later Thomas walks into the reception hall as Grandma and her husband to bear giving their vows. A few minutes later a man asks if anyone has any objections. Thomas then lies by saying Grandma is a lousy, no good, mean, rude, uncivil, ill-mannered, inhuman, unpleasant pet owner. She has only fed me rocks for 20 years. Grandma smells like rotting cheeseburger pie. I say Grandma needs to get her life together and bleep off. Screw you, Grandma. Anyways, it is time to light this place up. 1 second later, Thomas ignites his TNT. A few seconds later, everyone attending the wedding run for their lives. A minute later, Thomas and Grandma get out safely. 10 seconds later, the TNT explodes and kills 183 people. Grandma then screams with all her might. A few seconds later, Grandma picks up Thomas. The next scene is so gruesome and repulsively nauseating that if I explain what happens, you would wish you were deaf before listening to what happens. The end. Episode 44. Goodbye, Grandma. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Grandma is crying from Thomas's non-stop antics. A few minutes later, Grandma shouts for Thomas to get his worthless booty downstairs. A few seconds later, Thomas walks into the living room. A few seconds later, Grandma hands Thomas 3 suitcases. 1 second later, Grandma tells Thomas he has 10 minutes to pack his life into them 3 suitcases. A few seconds later, Grandma lies to Thomas when she says they are going on vacation. Thomas then speeds upstairs with his 3 suitcases. 10 minutes later, Thomas walks downstairs with everything he owns in the suitcases. A few seconds later, Grandma opens the front door. A few seconds later, Grandma tells Thomas he is getting kicked out of the house. Thomas then asks why. A few seconds later, Grandma locks the front door closed. Grandma then watches Thomas walk away. 3 hours later, police bang on the front door. A few minutes later, Grandma is sped off to a police station to be arrested for animal cruelty. Thomas then gets the house to his own. End of story. Episode 46. Thomas's laundry freakout. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Grandma is making the beds. A few seconds later, Grandma tells Thomas he has to do the laundry. Thomas then runs down to the basement. A few seconds later, Thomas starts throwing random clothes into the washing machines. A few seconds later, Thomas starts throwing clothes everywhere. 10 minutes later, Grandma hears massive bangs. A few seconds later, Grandma starts screaming her head off at Thomas. Thomas then stops smashing up the washer and dryer. A few seconds later, Grandma redacted. Thomas. The end. Episode 47. No more Chuck E. Cheeses. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are speeding off to a bankrupt Chuck E. Cheese's for Thomas's mega punishment day. A few minutes later, Grandma and Thomas arrive. 10 seconds later, the closed Chuck E. Cheese's explodes. Thomas then starts crying. 10 seconds later, Thomas and Grandma speed home. The end. Episode 48. Table explosion. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is cooking supper. A few minutes later, Thomas walks into the dining room for supper. 10 seconds later, Grandma serves some steamed vegetables to Thomas. Thomas then takes out a stick of TNT. 1 minute later, Grandma's dining room table explodes. The end. Episode 49. 5F-4.43 device. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is peacefully doing some gardening. A few minutes later, Thomas grabs a toy lightsaber. 2 minutes later, Thomas starts hitting Grandma. A few seconds later, Grandma grabs her 5F-4.43 device. A few seconds later, Grandma blasts Thomas. 1 second later, Thomas explodes into dust. The end. Episode 50. Thomas's car ride freakout. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is loading her SUV for a weekend getaway. A few minutes later, Thomas and Grandma speed off to a campsite that is over 5 hours away from the house. 10 minutes later, Thomas takes out a laser pointer. A few seconds later, Grandma says they have 5 hours and 34 minutes left in their drive. Thomas then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later, Thomas starts clawing up the leather covering. 1 second later, Grandma tells Thomas to buckle up. A minute later, a police officer pulls Grandma over. A few seconds later, the officer tells Grandma she is getting a $300 ticket for not everyone wearing their seatbelt. Grandma then speeds away after getting her ticket. The end. Episode 51. Thomas's homework meltdown. Plot. It is a peaceful fall afternoon in Utica, New York. Thomas is walking into his house after a long day of school. A few seconds later, Grandma tells Thomas he has homework to complete. A few seconds later, Thomas hands Grandma his stack of packets. A few seconds later, Grandma drags Thomas into her office. 10 seconds later, Thomas starts breaking everything to avoid his homework. A few seconds later, Grandma eliminates Thomas. The end. Episode 52. The Last Straw. Plot. It is a peaceful afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma is raging at Thomas because he blew up her boat. A few seconds later, Thomas starts insulting Grandma's bloodline. 2 seconds later, Grandma tells Thomas that the final straw has been broken. A few seconds later, Grandma starts overloading Thomas with chore after chore. 10 minutes later, Grandma beats the poop out of Thomas. An hour later, Grandma watches Thomas start cleaning the grass with a mop. 10 seconds later, Grandma starts nagging Thomas for no reason. 10 seconds later, Thomas blows up. 1 second later, Thomas throws the mop at Grandma. A few seconds later, Grandma starts chasing Thomas. 10 minutes later, Thomas is nothing but a pile of organs and bones. The end. Episode 53. Thomas destroys Grandma's shed. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is screaming her head off at Thomas. A few seconds later, Thomas walks outside with a hammer. 2 minutes later, Thomas starts to hammer Grandma's shed. 3 minutes later, Thomas finishes smashing her shed. A few seconds later, Grandma kills Thomas. The end. Episode 54. Thomas and the BB gun. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Grandma is crying from Thomas's daily trolls. A few seconds later, Thomas walks downstairs with a BB gun. 10 seconds later, Thomas shoots Grandma's booty. 1 second later, Grandma screams very loudly. A few seconds later, Thomas is decapitated. The end. Episode 55. Grandma's tank. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is driving her new military-grade tank home. A few minutes later, Grandma pulls up in front of the house. A minute later, Thomas strolls outside. 1 second later, Grandma points the barrel at Thomas. A few seconds later, Thomas explodes. The end. Episode 56. Thomas raids a military base. Plot. It is a peaceful day in Utica, New York. Thomas is sneaking into a military base to hijack a stealth bomber. A few seconds later Thomas sneaks past the front gate. 10 minutes later Thomas climbs aboard a stealth bomber. A few seconds later Thomas sits in the pilot seat. 2 minutes later Thomas starts taxiing to a runway. 8 minutes later the bomber stops remotely from an ATC tower. A few seconds later Thomas tries to override the lockdown. A few seconds later several military Humvees surround the bomber. A few seconds later Thomas opens the top hatch. 1 second later Thomas shouts, "I surrender. Please don't shoot me. I surrender and have no items on me." A minute later Thomas is placed in handcuffs. A few seconds later Thomas says Grandma's home phone number. Meanwhile, Grandma is washing some dishes. A few seconds later Grandma sees she got a call from a military base. Grandma then answers it. A few seconds later Grandma says she will be over shortly. 10 minutes later Grandma spots Thomas. A few seconds later Grandma looks at Thomas with disappointment. A few hours later Thomas is thrown into ADX Florence for trespassing on a government installation. The end. Episode 57. Thomas's airplane TV meltdown. Plot. It is a peaceful day in New York City. Thomas and Grandma are boarding a jumbo jet for their annual trip to Aruba. A few minutes later Thomas tries using the mini TV on the seat in front of him. An hour later the plane takes off. A few minutes later Thomas puts some headphones on. A few seconds later the person in the seat right in front of Thomas puts the seat back. A few seconds later Thomas screams with pure anger. 10 seconds later Thomas says he has a bomb. A few seconds later Grandma says he is lying. A minute later Thomas and Grandma start fighting. A few minutes later they are kicked off the plane. The end. Episode 58. Grandma's Xbox fire. Plot. It is a peaceful summer evening in Utica, New York. Grandma is getting really aggravated from Thomas's all-day raging. A few seconds later Grandma walks upstairs. 1 minute later Grandma walks outside with Thomas's Xbox. 2 minutes later the Xbox goes up in flames. A few seconds later Thomas douses the fire. 1 second later Grandma kills Thomas. The end. Episode 59. Thomas's grilled cheese freakout. Plot. It is a peaceful afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma is cooking some of her famous grilled cheeses. A few minutes later Thomas speeds into the kitchen for lunch. A few seconds later Thomas screams at Grandma. A few seconds later Thomas throws a burning hot grilled cheese at Grandma's face. 2 seconds later Grandma gets a third-degree burn. A few seconds later Grandma speeds off to a hospital. 2 days later Grandma walks into the house, only to see everything has been completely destroyed. A few seconds later Grandma finds Thomas ripping up some family photos. A few seconds later Grandma ends Thomas's life. The end. Episode 60. Thomas and Grandma's war. Plot. It is a chaotic day in Utica, New York. Thomas and Grandma are in the middle of a war because Thomas leaked Grandma's personal information on the dark web. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas get into a nasty brawl. 10 minutes later Thomas retreats to his base. A few seconds later Grandma throws a smoke grenade into Thomas's base. Episode 61. Grandma's attack helicopter. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is driving to a military base. Thomas is home alone. A few hours later Thomas hears a helicopter getting closer. A few minutes later Thomas sees it is an attack helicopter. A few seconds later Thomas sees Grandma is flying it. Thomas then screams with horror. A few seconds later Grandma lands the helicopter on the top of Thomas. The end. Episode 62. Thomas and the steak. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is cooking steak for lunch. A few minutes later Grandma shouts for Thomas because lunch is ready. 10 seconds later Thomas walks into the dining room. A few seconds later Grandma serves Thomas a piece of steak. 2 seconds later Thomas throws his steak to the floor. 3 seconds later Thomas gulps. 1 second later Grandma gives Thomas an eviction notice. Thomas then screams with pure anger. A few hours later Thomas is kicked out of the house for good. The end. Episode 63. Thomas's pancake meltdown. Plot. It is a peaceful spring morning in Utica, New York. Grandma is cooking pancakes for breakfast. Thomas is in the dining room, protesting for breakfast. 10 minutes later Grandma walks into the dining room with a massive stack of flapjacks. 1 minute later Thomas tucks into a pancake. 1 second later Thomas spits it out. Thomas then tells Grandma that the waffles taste like tree bark. A few seconds later Thomas runs outside with a stack of jacks. A minute later the flapjack stack is put up in flames. Grandma then eliminates Thomas. The end. Episode 64. Thomas sells the house. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas is calling a realty agency trying to put Grandma's house up for sale, just because he is bored. A few minutes later Thomas manages to put the house up for sale. An hour later Grandma walks into the house. A few seconds later a real estate agent meets up with Grandma. Grandma then says she owns the house. 1 second later the agent says that her house was sold 2 minutes ago. Grandma then looks at Thomas. Thomas then comes clean. A few seconds later Grandma chases Thomas. A few hours later Grandma picks up Thomas. The end. Episode 65. Grandma's revenge. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Grandma is making an evil plan to get back at Thomas for years of suffering. An hour later Grandma finishes setting up her house of horrors. A few seconds later Thomas walks into the house. 1 second later Thomas activates the house of horrors. 2 hours later Thomas spills into a jar as a liquid. A few seconds later Grandma throws out the jar. An hour later Grandma finishes cleaning up. A few seconds later Grandma finally celebrates her revenge. The end. Episode 66. Thomas makes a restaurant go bankrupt. Plot. It is a peaceful afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma and Thomas are speeding to a Captain Grill for supper. 2 hours later Thomas and Grandma get served their beverages. A few seconds later Grandma orders a steak. 10 seconds later Thomas starts ordering. 10 minutes later Thomas finishes ordering 17 of every menu item, and every item's customizations. A few seconds later Grandma roars at Thomas for ordering over 700 pounds of food. 10 hours later their food finally comes out. A few seconds later Thomas starts eating his 700-pound meal. 6 hours later Thomas finishes eating. An hour later Grandma pays the several $1 million receipt. A few seconds later Grandma rolls Thomas to the entrance of the Captain Grill. A minute later Thomas gets stuck into the double door entrance. Grandma then sighs. A few hours later Thomas finally gets free from the help of 12 firefighters. A few minutes later Thomas and Grandma speed home. 1 hour later they walk into the house. The end. Episode 68. Thomas goes back to school. Plot. It is a peaceful morning in Utica, New York. Grandma is cooking breakfast for her ungrateful cat Thomas. Soon Thomas walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later Thomas is given a single pancake. 1 second later Thomas slaps Grandma. 3 seconds later Grandma tells Thomas he needs school supplies. 1 second later Thomas hisses at Grandma. A few seconds later Grandma drags Thomas outside. A few seconds later Grandma throws Thomas into her Ferrari. 1 minute later Thomas and Grandma speed off to a Walmart. 10 minutes later Grandma drags Thomas into a Walmart. A few seconds later Thomas gets a shopping cart. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas walk over to the school supplies. 2 minutes later Thomas starts placing random school supplies into his cart. 8 seconds later Thomas says he is done. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas arrive at the checkout. 2 minutes later Grandma and Thomas speed home. 8 minutes later Thomas and Grandma walk into the house. 8 hours later Thomas and Grandma head to bed. 9 hours later Grandma drags Thomas downstairs for his first day of school. 10 minutes later Grandma and Thomas speed off to Thomas's high school. Little does Grandma know, Thomas placed a stick of TNT into his backpack. 5 minutes later Thomas walks into his high school. A few minutes later Thomas arrives at his homeroom. A few seconds later Thomas is given a get to know you survey. A few seconds later Thomas screams with pure anger. 1 second later Thomas grabs his stick of TNT and a portable lighter. 2 seconds later Thomas runs away. A few seconds later Thomas lights up the TNT. A few seconds later Thomas drops it. 1 second later Thomas runs for his life. A few seconds later the TNT explodes. A few minutes later Grandma arrives at the school. A few seconds later the headmaster tells Grandma that she has to pay $60 million to the city. A few seconds later Thomas gets expelled. 3 seconds later Grandma and Thomas speed home. 10 minutes later Thomas gets stabbed in the heart from Grandma with a meat cleaver. The end. Episode 69. Bridge Club. Plot. It is a peaceful summer evening in Utica, New York. In the Shoes household, Grandma is getting ready to go out to her weekly bridge club. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas walk out to Grandma's Tesla. 2 minutes later Grandma speeds off to her bridge club. 10 minutes later Grandma drags Thomas into a building. 3 minutes later Grandma arrives at a room where her bridge club is. A few seconds later Grandma takes out some metal chains. 10 minutes later Grandma finishes chaining Thomas to a chair. 3 minutes later Grandma gets focused when she starts playing bridge. A few seconds later Thomas finishes unchaining himself. A few seconds later Thomas calls Butch. 10 minutes later Thomas walks out of the room. A minute later Thomas and Butch walk into the owner's office of the building. A few seconds later Grandma and her friends hear and feel a massive explosion. A minute later Grandma and her friends resume playing bridge. 10 seconds later Grandma and her friends hear and feel more explosions. 10 minutes later the explosions get closer. A few minutes later Grandma and her friends get up. A few seconds later Grandma and her friends run out of the room. 2 seconds later the room explodes. A minute later Grandma and her friends run out of the building as it collapses. 10 seconds later Grandma and her friends take out weapons. A minute later Grandma and her friends surround Thomas and Butch. The next scene is so dreadful, horrendous, horrifying, frightful, grim, sickening, stomach-turning, nauseating and stomach-twistable that if you hear it you will have nightmares and PTSD for the rest of your life. In the end Thomas and Butch's fates are unknown. The end. End of show.